Is there slavery in the Bible? Like real slavery? Like slavery where the Arab conquest took the Europeans as slaves, where the Romans took the Judeans as slave, where the Europeans took Africans as slave? Is that slavery in the Torah? Let's find out.
Do you think slavery at all points in history was wrong? Well, you'd have to say yes, because in Leviticus 25:44 through 46, God says you can own people as slaves and pass them down to your children as inherited property for life.
okay,
And in Exodus
so-
21:20 through 21, God says you can beat those
Right,
slaves
so-
insofar as they recover after a day or two.
Ow! Scorching points. Anyone else have a question?
When the Bible says you can own other people as property, is that an error? What was it about those times that made it morally permissible to own people as property?
The answer, of course, is no. There is no allowance of slavery in the Torah, and I'll explain it to you. There are three places where the Torah talks about where the Israelites are allowed to own avodim. The one is when a person steals and he cannot pay his debt, so that is dealt with, and the person then works for someone else, gets sold to work for someone else until he pays off that debt. There's then the second instance is when a person is captured and he has to be redeemed from foreign enemies. So then you redeem that person. If the family has no money to redeem him, you can redeem the person, and the person works off his debt through you. The third one is when a person is very poor and wants to have money for his family. He sells himself into a servitude, and then he works off that debt. In all three of those situations, the Torah is very clear. You may not work them very hard. And a matter of fact, you don't believe that those verses there's further verses, because it says several times, because you were slaves in Egypt, therefore you cannot work hard. You're slaves because you were slaves in Egypt. Therefore, you're now my slaves, who are God's slaves, and therefore we can't work slaves hard. We were not allowed to beat slaves. We're not allowed to hurt slaves. We're not allowed to sell slaves. We couldn't keep slaves as property. We couldn't keep the children as property. Now, you're going to say in Exodus, it gives the allowance for someone to beat slaves. That's completely not true. In Exodus, it's talking about the criminal and civil penalties. As a matter of fact, one of the ways that these indentured servants go free is that they get struck. And besides, it wasn't even forever, because there was always a rule. First year, the slavery was capped at 6 years. It says that all the avodim, all the servants of Pharaoh, and that word avid are servants, they're not slaves. You can't say that an entire country were slaves to Pharaoh. And finally, the Jews were not slaves to Pharaoh either, because they actually own property. They own their own property. They have their own farms. Slaves do not own their own property and do not feed themselves, and they don't have farms. Instead, they were indentured servants, and they were not allowed to leave. Therefore, there is actually no slavery in the Torah. I hope that helps. Any questions, let me know.